We're afraid of what people will think, or we're afraid we're not good enough, or we're afraid we're too much. And so we hold ourselves back. When we do that, we're muting ourselves. And there are too many people that are muting themselves in the world. And I, for so many years, was one of them. I've discovered the power of unmuting myself, of showing up in the world in a way that is joyfully expressed and boldly alive. That's something that has been so important to me as I've discovered how freeing it is to be unmuted, to unmute our body and to unmute our ideas and to unmute our desires, to unmute ourselves in relationships and at work, and to be our own advocates and to ask for what we want and need. The unmuted life is a life that is fully alive and fully expressed and confident and clear. And to me, it's the only way that I know how to live now. I know what it's like to feel confined and stuck and small and silenced. And I also know what it feels like to be expressed and alive and joyful and present and seen. And it's so much better of a life to be unmuted. And that is what I want to bring you into. Are you ready to unmute yourself? Let's make it happen. Hi, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to Unmute Yourself. I'm your host, Rachel Druckenmiller, and I'm so excited to see all of the energy in the comments. I know we have almost 300 people that are going to be joining us today. So welcome Toby and Rachel and Anna and Rich and Marie and Cheryl and Elizabeth and Jay, Bill, Rebecca, so many people. I can't even say all of your names. Laura, Michaela, Zach, Crystal, Stevie, Bob. We're so glad that you're here. This is going to be a conversation that's going to kick off your year with motivation, with intention, with thoughtfulness, with maybe some challenging thoughts that are going to kind of stir up something inside of you that's going to help activate you in some way that's going to lead you to live this year with less regret, or with regret that is used in a more thoughtful way, hopefully. So again, so excited that you're here. Let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. I know we have people from all over the world that join the show. So feel free to let us know in the comments where you are joining us from. You know, this time of year, I find that this is a time when we naturally get introspective. We become reflective and we start to think about, you know, what from the year prior worked, what from the year prior didn't work that we wish had gone differently. And as we look in the year ahead, what do we want to see that's going to motivate us? What do we want to see happen that as we look, you know, back at the end of the year, say, I'm so glad I did that. I'm proud of myself for doing that. I'm grateful I had the courage to move forward in that way or to accomplish that thing. And at the end of each year, my husband and I go through a process where we reflect on a bunch of these questions. And a couple of the questions that we think about are, what are you most proud of? What were you not able to accomplish in the past year that you wanted to? And even questions about the relationships in our lives. So who are the three people who influenced you the most? And who are the three people that you influenced the most? So these are the types of questions that we ask. And that we reflect on and we take notes on and we share with each other. So it looks like we've got folks from all over, from New York and New Jersey to Iowa to Florida to Ohio, and Pennsylvania, Vermont, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Oklahoma. So glad y'all are here with us. And to get started, what I'd love to do is to invite you to think about what is something that you're proud of, something that you're proud of from the past year, something you accomplished, a way that you showed up in the world, to take a moment and drop it in the comments. And something that I'll share before I introduce our guest in just one moment, who I know you all are so excited to hear from today, is over the past couple of years, as I looked back previously on responses I had to these questions, there was a question of what were you not able to accomplish? And for the past 3 years, one of the things I wrote down was recording music. I've loved singing my whole life, but I was very, very shy, guarded, and timid, as I've shared on here before, and I didn't share my voice publicly for a really long time. It wasn't until the past 5 years that I started integrating it into what I do as a speaker. And as somebody who doesn't play any instruments or read music, I thought to myself, well, the fact that I can sing is great, but how could I ever write a song? And I hired a songwriting coach in September, and my first song is going to be released. My first original song will be released in 2 weeks, and I'm going to share it right here on the anniversary show on January 23rd. So heads up that is coming. Y'all are the first to hear about that, and I'm really excited that you're going to get to experience that. And I hope it motivates you to be more intentional about the way that you live your life this year. And there's so many things people are proud of: stepping out of their comfort zone, getting an amazing job with a new company, first keynote at a national conference. Paying off all credit card debt. Amazing. So many different things that y'all are proud of. Starting your own business. That's one of the boldness regrets that Daniel writes about in the book. So one thing I want to say before I introduce him is we're going to be raffling off 3 copies of the book, The Power of Regret. We're going to be raffling off 3 of these copies of this book at the end of the show today. And the way that you can participate in the raffle is just by dropping the hashtag unmute yourself. So hashtag unmute yourself in the comments at any point during the show, and you'll be entered into the raffle to win a copy of this book. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's guest. Daniel Pink is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including his latest, The Power of Regret: How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. His other books include the New York Times bestsellers When and A Whole New Mind, as well as the #1 New York Times bestsellers Drive and To Sell Is Human. Dan's books have won multiple awards, have been translated into 42 languages, and have sold millions of copies around the world. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his family, and I had the opportunity to meet him just over 4 years ago at a conference where he was speaking about his book, When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing. And every time I have the opportunity to learn from him, to hear him speak, to watch his TED Talk, to read one of his books, to hear him on a podcast, I leave feeling a bit more emboldened. I leave thinking a bit differently. And I know that that's how you are going to leave this conversation today. So without further ado, welcome Daniel Pink.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's good to be with you. Congratulations on your song. I guess I'm going to have to tune in on January 23rd to hear the world premiere.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's one of those things that you know, the thing I didn't want to have a regret on. You know, I looked back and I said, this is a thing I really want to do. And I kind of use that as fuel to say, well, it's not like it's a never, it's just a not yet. And now I can look back and see that progress over time of committing to it, you know? So I'm curious, one of the things that you write about in your book is what this study you conducted called the American Regret Project that included about 4,500 people. And you ask the question of how often do you look back on your life and wish you'd done things differently? And I'm curious from your perspective, how often do you look back on your life, whether it's annually, quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily? What does anything like that in terms of a practice look like for you of looking back for yourself?
For me, I would say I do it frequently. Less than daily, more than monthly. So that's where I am, and that makes me profoundly non-special. Let me double click on that question here for a moment. Can you say it again? Because it's actually how it's phrased is actually extremely important.
Yes. How often do you look back on your life and wish you'd done things differently?
Okay, so I asked that question to a random sample of 4,500 Americans, okay, in what I call the American Regret Project. It's the largest public opinion survey ever conducted on American attitudes on regret. This is not some kind of internet survey. This was a sample drawn from established panels working with a company called Qualtrics. It is a professional level public opinion poll because I wanted to assess where Americans' heads are with the concept of regret. But you'll notice that question. It describes regret, but it doesn't use the R word anywhere in there because we have this fog machine out there of no regrets, that you should always be positive, never be negative, always look forward, never look back. And what we found when we actually described regret, but didn't label it as such, we found that about 83% of Americans do this at least occasionally. The percentage of Americans who say they never do this, even though you have lots of people who say they have no regrets, the percentage of Americans who never look back and wish they had done things differently is 1%. So this tells us a lot about this profoundly misunderstood emotion of regret and how prevalent it is.
Yeah, I found that was fascinating, and how I think one of the one of the ways you summarized it was that regrets of inaction are far more common than regrets of action. So we're much more likely to regret things we didn't do than things that we did do. And that changed
That
over
is
time as people age.
that's a great point, Rachel. That is so in this to investigate. Let me take two steps back. To investigate this subject of regret, I went at it a number of different ways. One was this public opinion survey that we're talking about which more in a moment. I also looked at about 50 or 60 years of existing science on this emotion of regret, and then I also did another piece of research where I just collected lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of regrets from around the world. Now, getting back to this public opinion survey, the quantitative point, the quantitative survey, one reason that I had such a large sample, as you said, about 4,500, is so we could assess, are there demographic differences in regret? So do women regret different things from men, or more often than men? Do people with high levels of formal education have different regrets than people with less formal education, et cetera, et cetera? And what we found was not much. The demographic differences were small, to my surprise, but there was one key one, and you already nailed it, which is regrets of action versus inaction. When you, particularly when it comes to age, when we look at the architecture of regret, there are two kinds of regrets: regrets about what we did, regrets about what we didn't do. And what we found, and it's confirmed by existing research, is that especially over time, regrets of inaction are what stick with us. That when we're in our people in their 20s in the survey had about equal numbers of regrets of action and inaction. But as people got older, wasn't even close. Even into the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, regrets of inaction were, especially when you get to 40s, 50s, 60s, 2 to 1, sometimes 3 to 1 more prevalent. So what really sticks with us over time is what we didn't do.
Well, I have to say, it's something I appreciate about that research is I felt very validated in a lot of my life's choices when I was reading this book, because you made a comment about, for instance, if you set up a travel agency for people that wish they'd studied abroad in college, you'd make a mint.
Yeah, that when we collected, another part of the research, when we collected regrets from all over the world, that was a surprisingly prevalent regret. But here's the key point here that we really to really emphasize here, and it's this. And again, we have a half century of science on this. Of cognitive science, of the social psychology, of developmental psychology, of neuroscience, and what it tells us very clearly is this. Everybody has regret. Regret is one of the most common emotions that human beings have. It's arguably the most common negative emotion that human beings have. It is pervasive. It is prevalent. It is ubiquitous. Truly, it's so widespread that the only people who don't have regrets are 5-year-olds, because their brains haven't developed enough, people with certain kinds of neurodegenerative diseases and brain lesions, and sociopaths. So if you don't have any regrets, it's a sign that you're either 5 or you have some kind of pretty severe problem. And so this is kind of weird, right? So because as we know, I have regret. I don't like experiencing regret. The argument that I'm making here is not that regret feels good. No, regret feels crappy. It's terrible. I don't like it. So you have this emotion that is unpleasant but widespread. It is aversive, and yet it's ubiquitous. So the question then is why? Why does it exist? And the reason that it exists is because it's useful if we treat it right. And we just haven't been treating it right. Some of us ignore our regrets. We put our fingers in our ears and say, blah, 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 no regrets. I'm always positive. I'm never negative. I'm always looking forward. I never look backward. Some of us go the other extreme, that we wallow in our regrets. We stew in our regrets. We ruminate on our regrets. That's really bad too. What we need to be doing is confronting our regrets, using them as information, as data, as signals. And when we do that, it is a transformative emotion on almost every aspect of our life.
Yeah. Well, and there were 4 types of regrets that you wrote about in the book. There were 2 that I want to dig into. I want to mention all 4. There's 2 I want to dig into because they're so connected to this idea of living this unmuted life.
Absolutely,
but there were 4. Yeah. So tell us about that. Tell us about those 4 different regrets that you found most common.
Sure thing. Sure. And let's connect it to the unmuting. let's connect to the unmuting principle, because there's one in particular that is so, Rachel, directly related to this. So again, as always, let's take a step back. Here's what I did. I set up something called the World Regret Survey, just a website, worldregretsurvey.com, where I invited people around the world to submit a big regret. People responded in very large numbers. Right now, we have a database of over 24,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. It's incredible. And one of the things that I did was, in a very painstaking way, was I didn't read through all 24,000 regrets, but I did read through the first 15,000 of them. And what I found is that when you look at what do people regret, the traditional categories that we use were a little bit off. We often say, this is a career regret, this is a romance regret, this is a finance regret. And what I found is that something more interesting was going on beneath the surface. That around the world, people seem to have the same 4 core regrets. One of them are what I call foundation regrets. Foundation regrets are small decisions or indecisions that you make early in life that accumulate to negative consequences later in life. I spent too much and saved too little. That's a big one. I didn't exercise or eat right, and now I'm 45 years old and profoundly unhealthy. So those are sort of things that rock your stability. Another one are moral regrets, a small category, but very deeply felt. I basically had a choice in my life to take the high road or the low road, and I took the low road, and now I regret it. I cheated on my spouse. I bullied people. I did something else that violated my own moral code. Third category, connection regrets. Connection regrets, and here we're sort of edging into some of the ones that I think are connected more to unmuting. Connection regrets are about relationships, not only romantic relationships, but the full spectrum of relationships in our lives. And what happens is you see it a lot in friendships. So, you have a friend and you haven't talked to them for a while, and you say, I really should reach out to Barney. And then and you say, well, it's been like 6 years. So that's going to be really awkward if I reach out. And besides, he's not going to care. So you don't. Mm-hmm. And then you wait another couple of years, and now it's 8 years and it feels more awkward, and you think he's going to care even less. And sometimes it's too late, and people really regret not reaching out. So that's the connection regrets. And the final one, which I think is most on point for unmuting, is boldness regrets. Mm-hmm. Almost all of our regrets begin at a juncture in our life. We look backward and we're at a juncture. And at this juncture, for these kinds of regrets, these boldness regrets, you can play it safe or you can take the chance. You can play it safe or you can take the chance. And overwhelmingly, not all the time, just to be clear here, but most of the time, when people don't take the chance, they regret it. And it doesn't matter the domain of life. I got people who, so for instance, someone in your community talked about how they're pumped to have started a business. Huge regret that people have. If only I'd started a business. If only, you mentioned before, if only I traveled abroad. Now, enormous numbers of regrets about not asking somebody out on a date years ago, which is a form of muting, I think. Mm-hmm. But here's the one that I think is most telling, and it connects directly to you, is that if you go into my database, or if someone goes into my database and searches for the phrases, speak up, speaking up, mm-hmm. spoken up, it's extraordinary how often you see that. And people have deep regrets about, to use your parlance, muting themselves, about not speaking up. And that, I think, it's a big part of these boldness regrets. So again, just to summarize, and then I'll shut up. We've got foundation regrets, if only I'd done the work. Moral regrets, if only I'd done the right thing. Connection regrets, if only I'd reached out. And boldness regrets, if only I'd taken the chance. And it's really remarkable around the world how consistent these regrets are, to the point where, if I randomly selected, we should have done this, randomly selected like 4 regrets. I don't know if you would be able to tell if they were from, Gaithersburg, Maryland, or Sheboygan, Wisconsin, or Jakarta, Indonesia, or Moldova. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know any cities in Moldova, so I ruined that series.
You're on your own with that. I'm also not informed. But it's interesting. There's some. So first of all, I appreciate all of that, and I think I like the way that you had those all pulled out and structured, because when I thought about even, and I'd love to get a story from you in a moment. when I think about what motivates me to do what I do, so much of it is that I see people holding back. I see them doubting themselves. I see them sort of tolerating a life that is other than what they want. And I find that I get messages from people after keynotes and workshops, and people will say things like, I booked a vacation, I asked for a raise, I asked for a promotion, I left my job, I tried out for a play, I saw a doctor for a nagging issue I'd had that I'd been ignoring, or I apologized to my spouse and my kid. I've even had people say I left an abusive relationship because of just the importance of recognizing. I talk about your book in these sessions that I do, and reminding people about the importance of living with boldness. And so I'm curious, in your own life, you share so much about, I love the way you combine research with storytelling, and you do it in a way that's accessible. And I also like to learn more about, you personally. So I'm curious, as you think back, whether it's a personal or professional, what's a way that you have muted yourself, held back, silenced yourself, experienced doubt that that you look back on, and you can connect to? And what's a way that you moved through that? What's a way that you went from being muted to unmuted in any area of your life?
Girl, that's a great question, and it's connected, and it shows. I think when you hear my quick response to that, or probably won't be quick, but when you hear my response to that, you'll see the connection between muting and regret. So I have many regrets, but one of my big regrets are regrets of kindness. Now, one of the things we see in the World Regret Survey is that we have a lot of people who have regrets about being bullies. I bullied somebody 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now I really regret it. We even have some cases of more cases than I would have expected, of people going back to the people whom they bullied and apologizing. And it turned out in many cases that the people doing the bullying were far less traumatized than the people who were bullied, over time. It's kind of interesting in itself. Now, here's the thing. I was never a bully. I never bullied anybody, at least to my knowledge. But there were many moments in my life, especially when I was much younger, where I was in situations where people were being left out, people were being excluded, they were being treated unfairly. I saw it happening. I knew it was wrong. And here's the thing. I didn't say anything. I muted myself. And the reason I didn't say anything is because I was a wimp. And I felt people would look at me weird if I did that I didn't have the courage to say something, to speak up. And that has bugged me. That bugged me for, literally, Rachel, decades. And so the question then becomes, and the question at the heart of all of our regrets is, what do I do with that negative feeling? All right. Do I say, forget about it, no regrets, be positive? Bad idea. Do I say, oh my God, I am singularly the most wretched person ever to walk on God's green earth. I am irredeemable. That's a bad idea too. What I should be doing is saying, wow, this kind of inaction, kind of weird because a lot of the moral regrets are actions. Mine was an inaction. This muting, let's call it a muting. This muting is something I regret. It's something that I did. The muting is an action, I guess. I muted myself. I made this decision 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I still remember it, and it still makes me feel bad. That's a pretty strong signal. It's telling me something. And what it's telling me, and again, it's what regret tells us, is this. It clarifies what I value, and it instructs me on how to do better. It clarifies what I value and instructs us on how to do better. So what it tells me is that, hey, man, you value kindness more than you might realize. If you had said to me, is kindness one of your top values? I would say, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I would have said that. But the fact that acts of unkindness stick with me for so long suggests that kindness is something that I value. And second, it tells me how to do better. And what it tells me, again, bringing this back full circle, is that you got to fricking unmute yourself, man. So what is that? What are the consequences of that? I now am, again, I don't want to paint myself as more virtuous than I really am. But if I'm in situations now where I see that, where someone is being excluded or left out, even something much more benign, like there's sometimes you go to gatherings and there's like a scrum of people together, and then there are a few other people sort of singly kind of marooned and feeling awkward and out of it, I will affirmatively go over and bring those people into my scrum.
Mm.
And I would not have done that had I not had this negative feeling and done something with it, and basically spoken up. And so it's a way of unmuting myself instead of saying, oh, you know what, that's not my problem. I don't care about that. It's going to be awkward to go over there. I unmute myself, go over there and say, hey, come and talk to us. And there's not been a single time where that was a bad idea. Not once has that been a bad idea.
Oh. Something I appreciate that I'm noticing about what you're sharing there is that it's like a combination of a connection and a boldness. Like kind of what you're doing is you're choosing to connect, you're choosing to be bold by speaking up, and you're choosing to do what you feel is the right thing. So I feel like it's almost like that trifecta of, if you look at moral boldness and connection regrets, that
That's
choosing to
interesting.
act on that. Yeah.
That's interesting. I actually, it's good. It's a good analysis. I actually had it more kind of singularly about a moral regret, and I never, I never really thought about it in terms of unmuting. I mean, again, not speaking up. The flip side of that is muting oneself. So, and it ends up being a really big. It ends up being a really big regret that spans a lot of realms of life. And one thing about these regrets about speaking up that we have to think about is, and something, again, I think there's a deeper lesson here. And so how do we evaluate people's behavior? All of our behavior is the intersection of who we are and the situation that we're in. So a lot of times when we try to explain people's behavior, we put too much on their personal qualities, their disposition, their personality, and not enough on the situation that they're in. And so in many cases, as I interviewed people or even read some of their regrets without interviewing them, some of these regrets about speaking up weren't really regrets. They were essentially descriptions about being in an environment, being in a situation that lacked the psychological safety in which they could speak up. So sometimes I don't know, you might disagree with this. Sometimes I think that we mute ourselves, and it's a perfectly logical response to an environment that we're in where it's actually not safe to speak up. It's actually not safe to unmute. And that's a lesson, I think, for leaders, for teachers, for coaches, for anybody who has a role in configuring, the rules and the ethics and the structure of the situations that we're in.
Yeah, it's a form of self-protection.
Sure. I mean, again, if the people who, let me make this specific. There's one that I remember. It's a woman from Texas. She was in her 50s, and she talked about how she uses speaking up. She said, she was often the only Hispanic woman in the C-suite, and she often would mute herself. She would say, "I didn't speak up, even though I had something to contribute." And she regretted that. And it was obviously a painful regret for her. But, the way I look at that is like, yeah, okay, some of that is a regret, because a regret requires your own agency. But some of that it's not all on her. It's about being in an environment where a Hispanic woman had difficulty speaking up, where being different from other people if you were different from other people, you lacked the psychological safety that other people had in speaking up, in dissenting, and disagreeing with the people at the top. And so I think there's a really important lesson here for leaders, for anybody who runs anything, whether it's a small team or a classroom or a big company, which is that, you have to create the conditions in which people feel free to speak up, that when we don't speak up, it's partly on us, but it's also partly on the situation that we're in.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, for us to be mindful of those, of how we might contribute to that, right? And if we see that someone maybe is not having a voice and wants something to contribute, is there a way that we are in a position to speak up, to advocate, that this is where advocacy can come up for other people? We can speak up on their behalf if someone doesn't have the ability or the space or the position to do that on their own confidently.
It's a great point. It's something definitely to think about. And I don't think there's necessarily a perfect way to do that. One of the things that I do, and I'm not sure, I'd be curious what you think about this. I'm not sure it's always a good idea, is that, I do think that there are, especially like in meetings and things like that, there are people who mute themselves. And I think that if you're running the meeting, or if you have a role in the meeting, I think it's often helpful to say to, hey Fred, not hey Fred, but Fred, we haven't heard from you. What do you think? And I have found that most times, not all times, so most times that can be helpful. That act itself gives Fred a smidgen at least of psychological safety. There are times, maybe 1 out of 20, where that actually isn't a good idea because that person is there's so little psychological safety that you're um, that you're actually having that person do something that is profoundly and deeply uncomfortable and against their interests. But
Yeah.
19 times out of 20 is a pretty good bet.
Yes, agreed. And Kristen here affirms what you were saying. Important reminder for leaders about the importance of creating a safe space, and that's so much of what the responsibility is of a leader, to create a
Absolutely.
space where people feel safe. What you were sharing. Are you familiar with the book The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate?
Yeah.
So one of the
I haven't
things he
read it,
writes.
but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
I just finished it, 500 pages. It's a doozy, but
It's too
so good. I
long.
mean, fascinating. It's a long book. But one of the things he talks about is, and I think it's connected to the work you do around regret, is that we have these two fundamental needs: to be in attachment and to be authentic. And if our need to be authentic, which in some ways can look like being bold, threatens our sense of attachment in some way, that we will choose to kind of suppress our authenticity for the sake of being in attachment. If that means in a meeting, for instance, so my sense of
Yeah.
belonging in this group is contingent on the fact that I am not someone who speaks up and asserts myself because I value feeling safe, in the sense of being accepted, even if I can't really be myself here. And so I think that's one of the things people do. They compromise a sense of authenticity for the sake of being an attachment. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on
I mean,
that.
I think that's another way of analyzing this. I think that in some ways that's a frame that helps explain, that it's that you can use that frame to describe and analyze the story that I told you a few moments ago. I mean, why did I not want to speak up when I was 20 years old and somebody was being excluded? Because
Mm,
I didn't want to be left out myself. I didn't want to lose that attachment. So maybe, again, we can quibble with the exact language. I don't know whether my speaking up was an act of authenticity. Maybe,
mm,
maybe not. But it was certainly the threat of being detached was the thing that stopped me from doing that. There's no question about that.
mm,
And you see that you see that often in, again, it goes to what we were talking about before, that if we want to use this language of authenticity and attachment, I don't think that we have to look at them as antagonistic. I think that what we have to do is we have to look at them as eminently compatible.
mm.
I personally want to be attached to people who are authentic, right? I don't feel a deep sense of attachment to people who are BSing me, who are
Yeah.
suppressing who they really are. And so, but once again, we have to think about this. Forgive me for being so theoretical about this,
No,
but
it's
we
fine.
have to think about this as, you know, what are the ingredients that propel human beings to do what they do? And it's partly, as I said before, it's an interaction. It's an interaction of who they are and the situation that they're in.
Mhm.
And so, and we have control over the situation. We have control over the situation. And if you are, again, as I said before, if you're running anything, if you have any design control over the configuration of anything, I think it's a good way to think about it. It's like, what are the barriers to attachment here? What are the barriers to people being authentically who they are? Now, I don't think that attachment and authenticity are um, perfectly compatible all the time. But I think it's something to aspire to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for kind of going down that little rabbit trail. I think it's, certainly connected. And this is actually my mother, Nancy Bryant. She, many times in a classroom as a student, I'd ask questions hesitantly, but I did it because I knew there were people who were too shy to ask the questions, but would have to have an answer. So like
But that's
sometimes speak to that.
but your mother makes a really good point. Now it's interesting. There is a kind of you know, a lot of it, again, if we're going back to fundamentals here, a lot of it has to go to a lot of this goes to how we think about ourselves and how we think about other people. And a lot of times we think of ourselves as profoundly different and singular and not unlike and unlike everybody else. And that's often not the case. So, what your mother is describing in part is a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, where what the barrier to asking that question in class is you say, oh, it's an attachment barrier, maybe in Gabor's language, but is to say, oh my God, if I ask a question, it'll show that I don't know what's going on, that I don't understand what's happening, and people will look down on me. But the ignorance is not the ignorance of the thing itself. It's the ignorance that you're not that special. That if you're confused, a lot of people are confused. And so, in fact, as your mother is saying, that if you actually raise your hand and ask that question, there are going to be a lot of people, as your mother is saying, who welcome that because they're feeling the same way that you are. And so, I think one of the, it's interesting. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about sort of, how, when do we say, yeah, I'm like everybody else, or when do we say, I am this unique, authentic person? And that's a hard thing to tease out. There's an old journalistic adage that goes like this, for writers, always extrapolate from your own experience. You're not that special.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm wondering here, there's a question that came through. How does regret affect trust, the ability to trust and the ability for others to trust us? Curious if you've seen any connection.
I think that trust is, I think trust is at the center of many, of many aspects of human relations, obviously. When it comes to, so just to dissect that in those two ways that Joseph is saying, you do have to have a certain degree of trust to reveal your regret to somebody else. But my view, again, going back to pluralistic ignorance, is that we should have more trust than we currently have. And the reason is this, and we have good evidence of this. We fear that when we disclose our vulnerability, when we disclose our mistake, when we disclose our regret, when we do that kind of unmuting, we fear that kind of disclosure will prompt people to think less of us. And we have some pretty good evidence that most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it's the exact opposite. People think more of us. And so if you flip that and you say, if somebody shared a regret or a mistake with you, would you think less of them? And in most cases, we would say no. And then you have to say, well, if I share a regret, why would people think less of me? So that's the trust. So I think we should have more trust. I think we should have more trust in than we currently have. Now, it also, so I think divulging our regret requires a degree of trust, but we should probably have a little bit more trust than we do. And in fact, one sort of tool that you can use is, in many situations, not every situation, but I think that you basically begin with trust and begin with positive intent and, let the other side disprove that. Rather than what, sort of more lawyerly approach is you begin with skepticism, you begin with distrust, you begin with lack of trust, and only after the other side has crossed many, many hurdles do you offer up that trust. Now, again, I think there's some situations where that's the right move, but I think in many situations where we assume negative intent, we begin from a position of distrust, and I think that holds us back.
Yeah, I think so too. And I want to ask a question related to kids in a moment, but something that is coming up for me as you're responding to that is I think about my own experience of 6 years ago, I burned out and got mono, Epstein-Barr virus, from just pushing myself too hard for too long. I regretted basically putting work above everything. I remember looking back and missing my niece's second birthday party. I was laying on the couch really, really sick, and my husband was sending me pictures and videos. And I thought to myself, this is not what I want my life to look like. And it was, going through that experience that made me realize that I need to shift something here. Something needs to change. And sometimes those really dark and low moments can shift something for us and can wake us
Sure.
up in a way, right?
Sure.
And I feel like one of the things I did was the ironic thing is I was the director of well-being for my company at the time, and I was totally burned out and not exactly the poster child for what for my title. And I was so afraid to publicly communicate the fact that I had burned out. I even got some pushback. It was like, she's the wellness person from within, some colleagues. Why is she talking about burning out? And I noticed that once I started doing that, once I started talking about it, that it made people feel more connected to me, because they thought, oh, she's not on a pedestal as a wellness person. She's one of us and she struggles with the same things. And it's been the reason why I share very vulnerably in the work that I do now, because I found that it's the quickest way to connect with people.
Amen. I mean, I think that, we, again, everything is a calibration. So there are people who overshare, no question about that.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the vast minority. I think most of us undershare because we're concerned about what other people will think. And we don't, again, coming back again, we don't extrapolate from our own experience. If that person shared something vulnerable with you, would you think less of them? No, you'd probably think more of them. So why wouldn't they be just like you?
Right. The courage. It's like we admire, there's this contagion to courage, that when we see somebody else being courageous, that it's something that can activate that
Great
in us
point.
as well,
Great point. Yeah.
Somebody asked a question here about, I think it was Becky. There we go. How do we instill this idea to unmute in our children, especially when they're young? How do we teach them about regret? So curious about, as a parent, I know you're a parent, how has this affected your parenting? How would you share any insights with parents around regret?
Well, I am a parent of 3 kids. My kids are older. My kids are all in their early 20s. So, they're a lost cause. Um, and no, I think that with parenting in general, I mean, again, this is totally cliche, but it's basically about modeling the behavior you want. One of the things I think about parents and I think about bosses that they get wrong is kids listen to parents way less than they think, and they watch what they do way more than they think. And so, model the behavior you want. So I think it's a very healthy conversation with your kids to talk about, say, one of your regrets. I think kids have to be, maybe, 9 or 10 at least. I think that, again, we just know from developmental psychology that it's not until about 7 or 8 that kids have the cognitive capacity to do the kind of mental time travel that with the regret, we're like going back in time, we're negating what happened, we're coming to the present's reconfigured. So, wait till kids are 9 or 10. But I think it's a very healthy conversation to talk to your kids about a regret, saying, here's a regret that I have. But again, don't stop there. Here's a regret that I have. Here's what I learned from it. And here's what I'm going to do about it. And I think that I think that's very healthy role modeling for children. I think we do have a lot of kids today who are absolutely terrified about screwing up, making mistakes, being imperfect. And that holds them back both in terms of what they can contribute to the world, but it also, holds them back, psychologically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think about some things my parents did that influenced me in a positive way around regret is when I had the choice to study. I lived in Spain, southern Spain, for a semester in college, which was amazing, but no one in my immediate family had ever been outside of the United States before. And I was such a homebody and I was afraid to leave. And I remember talking to my mom, and she said I had the opportunity to go to France, even if it was just for a few weeks, when I was in college or just out of college, and I didn't do it. And I wish I'd done it. And at that time, she shared that with me. And I thought to myself, as scared as I am to go to this place where I've never been before, speaking a language that I'm hardly fluent in, this is something that I don't want to look back on and have the same regret my mother has in her, 40s or 50s for something that I'm now choosing to do. And it's one of the best decisions I ever made. It was that experience of studying abroad and being in this immersed in this culture of vibrant, bold people, that when I came back, I tried out for my first solo. I was in gospel choir in college, and I tried out for my first solo. And that was the thing that catalyzed me sharing my voice. And so it's like there's this compounding effect of choosing to be bold. I'm curious if you've seen that in your experience of that, the compounding effect of being bold and how it affects multiple areas, like in a ripple effect.
Sure. I mean, that's a compounding effect is one way to do it. The other thing that it does is it was one way to sort of to think about that. I think that's the case. The other thing that being bold does is that it makes us realize that our initial assessment of risk was misstated. So we think it's going to be much riskier to do what we do, and then when we try something and it's not as risky as we think, then at some level in our head we recalibrate how much risk we actually have, and when the risk goes down, we're more likely to act. But I think that is a I think that form of parental storytelling can be super useful.
Yeah. And I think to your point, seeing what they do is powerful too, because I remember when I was in 8th grade, my dad's always run his own business. And so I've always known him to work for himself, but my mom's a financial planner and she worked for somebody else. And they went to a Tony Robbins conference and walked on coals and came back. And I was 13. I remember they walked in the foyer and my dad said, "Mom's going to start her own business." And as a 13-year-old girl, hearing that about my mom, that was something really empowering. And now she's had her own business for 25 years. And I started mine just over 3 years ago after leaving a 13-year corporate career. And I know that so much of what gave me the courage to believe I could even make this work is because they gave me this really skewed reality that it's normal to work for yourself and that you can be successful doing it. So I think both the words and the modeling can really have a powerful impact, I think more than parents realize.
Amen.
So I'm curious. I know there's
Don't
a
walk
few
on, but don't walk on coals, kids.
I'm not. Yeah, none of that.
Bad for your feet.
Bad for your feet, for sure. I know there's other questions that have come through that I've missed, so feel free to drop them in if you didn't get your question asked. Somebody said, any strategies for dealing with those situations? I know I mute myself more than I should, although I've slowly improved, but still tend to regress in situations where I'm afraid of criticism from a workplace bully. So, any thoughts on people navigating bullies at work and how to deal with that?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. A lot of it depends on the situation. There are a few things you can do. One of my favorite techniques is to do some self distancing and ask yourself, if my best friend were in this situation, what would I tell her to do? And people, we end up being pretty good problem solvers, we human beings, but pretty bad problem solvers of our own solvers of our own problems.
Mhm.
And so self-distancing, we have some good evidence that is an effective way of doing that. And so this technique, what would I tell my best friend to do, is useful there, because what you might tell your best friend to do is like, oh my God, that guy's a freaking idiot. Don't worry about him. What's he going to do to you? You've totally overstated it. So that's one thing. Another thing to do, which I like when people feel, again, this is slightly about risk, is take it from the amorphous to the concrete. And what I mean by that is this: I don't want to speak up because so-and-so is a jerk and might say something. All right. I think what you really have to do, so that's kind of amorphous. What's more granular, more practical, more concrete is to play out, say, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? What's the worst thing that can happen? Someone will say that. Eduardo, who's the jerk over there, if I say something in a meeting, Eduardo will laugh and dismiss my idea. Okay, what happens then? Well, I don't know. Maybe someone actually will hear my idea and like it. Maybe a lot of people who will think that Eduardo is an ass for doing. I mean, you just have to, like, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is you have in that case, I mean, who knows? You have a mildly uncomfortable moment, and yet you've gotten your idea out there. So I think I think a lot of times when people actually think through, push the analysis through, what's the worst thing that can happen? They realize that the worst thing that can happen isn't that bad. And in fact, in many cases, it's not that much different from the status quo. So those are two things that you can do: push to the worst case scenario, and then do some self-distancing and say, what would you tell your best friend to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. Somebody mentioned here, Amanda mentioned Bully Proof by Rob Fazio is another excellent resource for finding our power and being confronted by bullies. So there you go. There's a comment about people navigating that. I also find Kim Scott's work around radical candor, I think, can be really helpful about speaking the truth with care, and what she says about that. I think is a way to get connected. Now, I know and by the way, feel free to drop questions. I have another question for you, Dan. There's something you shared on LinkedIn, I don't know, maybe a week or two ago, about a resource that you used. It was by Shane Parrish and the Farm.
Oh yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. So I'm curious, one of the questions that he asked, in a series of questions, what do I want to spend more time on this year, and what do I want to spend less time on this year? And if it's not prying too much, I'm curious how you would respond to that. Like, what are you focusing on spending more time on this year and less time on this year?
I'm focusing much more on doing creative work, on actually
Mm-hmm.
producing stuff and creating stuff and coming up with new things and bringing them into the world. Um, that's something that I haven't done enough of in the last, certainly in the last year, and certainly, in arguably in previous years, particularly stuff that is different from what I've done in the past. So that's a top priority for me. The only way to get that done, of course, is to stop doing other things. And so, among the things that I am trying to do is far fewer, um, far fewer kind of administrative things where I'm responding to something else that someone wants from me, whether it's, can you answer my email? Can you be on my podcast? Can you do this favor for me? Can you do that favor for me? Can you participate in this thing? And I think a lot of times we get seduced into doing things that are, sort of moderately interesting. But there's another decision-making tool that I've used. I think it's originally from Derek Sivers. It's hard to do, and you have to be at a certain position, I think, sort of, an age or whatever, to be able to do this with extreme confidence. Is that if you're given an inquiry or request, you say, if it's not a heck yes, it's a no.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not a heck yes, it's a no. And so those are the things I'm trying to do. So more time, dedicated time for creativity, creating things, putting them in the world, things I haven't done before. And then protecting, spending less time on things that are kind of moderately interesting, but not heck yeses.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing this. I was curious as I was reading through this. I thought they were great questions. It's a set.
I think that's fantastic. I mean, if you want to, you should put give people the link to that. I think it's really, really good question. I'll tell you another one that I really liked is that if someone were filming your life, what would you want them to see and what would you want them not to see? And that gives you some very, very good ideas of like what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, I felt convicted reading that. I was like, let's see, what would not be interesting is me scrolling on Instagram or whatever else I do. That's not the biggest use of biggest and best use of my time. So I think that's helpful and important. And I just want to make sure we drop in a couple more things I want to chat about, but we're going to drop in the chat and the comments, just ways people can stay connected with you. Certainly on your website, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram. I find that what you share is just always so fascinating. Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we mention? We'll do a raffle too, but we've dropped those links in. Just curious about anything else you'd want to bring attention to.
No, that's good.
Okay. All right. Somebody asked a question, Andrew, how do you decide that it's a heck yes? So for you, are there kind of like a series, like almost like a matrix of questions or whatever, things that help you decide, or is it more a gut feeling?
Gut feeling.
Yeah.
Gut feeling. I mean, you know it. It's like if someone says to me, someone comes to me today and says, I'm a Washingtonian. I live in Washington D.C. If someone comes to me today and says, "Hey, I've got courtside seats to the Wizards game. Do you want to go?" I don't need a matrix. That's a heck yes. If someone says, "Can you do a this 5-question questionnaire?" Answer these 5 questions for a side of the blue, someone I don't know, I don't have a previous connection with, says, "Can you answer these 5 questions for my newsletter?" It might be moderately interesting, but it's definitely not a heck yes.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I know I appreciate personally the fact that you said yes to this, and I'm wondering if folks could drop in the comments just what the greatest gift was from today's experience. So something that you heard today that was particularly meaningful to you, a takeaway, an action step that you are gonna take forward with you. Feel free to drop that into the comments, and then the hashtag unmute yourself. We're gonna do the raffle. I'll ask one more question. Let's do a quick raffle. I'm going to raffle off 3 copies of your book, Dan, because I just think it's great.
Let me see that book. For a second. You get the large print edition.
I know.
So it's only for so the criteria, you have to be over 75 in order to enjoy this book.
Could I tell you how much flack I got for this when I posted on Instagram? I got comments, "Why did you get the large print?" I'm like, look, I didn't pay attention when I was ordering. I just ordered the book. But there's that. So we're going to do I'm going to see some of the comments coming through, and I know Tim's going to be running. And Tim, you just give me a nod when we're good and we've got the raffle ready to go. People are saying regrets clarify what we value and instructs us on how to do better. Types to regret are very helpful. Be bold and take a chance. It's going to have to be a heck yes. Regret could be an opportunity for learning. Large print forever. I like large print. Don't start with skepticism and negative intent. Listening to my regrets clarifies what I value and instructs me to do better. Love this positive spin on a negative emotion. So let's go ahead. It looks like we've got a lot of entries here. If you haven't already, it's going to be hashtag unmute yourself. And we love large print books over here. See, what's the worst? Ask what's the worst that can happen. We've got a fun crew, I'm telling you. Regret is inherently connected to belonging. All right, Tim, let's go ahead and let's see who our winners are here. Drum roll. I know there's a way I can do this on my little Stream Deck thing here. All right, who do we have? Winner, Peter Plamo. Congratulations, Peter.
Peter.
You are going to get a copy of the book. Let's do this just 2 more times. And then as we're doing this, as we're kind of running through these people are like, great, now I'm in. I'm curious, what are you most excited about, Dan, in the year ahead? Something that is making you feel emboldened and alive, is personally or professionally, something that you're most looking forward to in the year ahead?
I'm looking forward to the fact that I have essentially closed my calendar to almost every obligation, so I can focus on experimenting with some new projects.
Excellent. Wonderful. Like, we can't wait to see what they are, and we'll be ready for them once they're released. Tim, let's do just 2 more quick. And if you want to run it in the background, Tim, and then I'll just say again, Dan, thank you so much. We can hide there we go. Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Tim's a rock star in the background there, making things happen that I don't. Again, talk about getting people that know to do the things that you're not skilled in. Something I've learned. I do appreciate you being on this show and having this conversation. As I was reading your book, I felt so connected. And interestingly, full circle moment, the conference I met you at, the Maryland SHRM conference in the fall of 2018, where you were keynoting and talking about when, I just got outreached by them to potentially keynote the conference this year. So it just feels like a really funny, the timing of that was interesting to me because I just got that email last week.
Nice.
So yeah, I thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the way that you combine science and storytelling and the way that you make it accessible. I've been a fan of yours for over a decade, and it's a highlight of my year already, having the opportunity to have this conversation with you and to invite other people to think about how they can do better. And Peter says, wow, I now do not regret not having bought this book yet. So since he was our winner. Fantastic.
And you don't need reading glasses to read it, Peter, because the print is so huge.
Size 24 font, whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. Tim, why don't you let us know who our final 2 winners are, if you even want to just pull it up on the screen. Zach says, thank you. This is awesome. Thanks for the discussion. Of course, this has been great. Yeah, Leslie says, listen to you on Brené Brown. That was a really great interview that you had with Brené too. This has been great today. So, and any last, our final 2 winners are Cheryl Marvin and Lisa Salin. So congratulations, Cheryl and Lisa will be reaching out to you to get you your books. And our next show is going to be January 23rd, noon Eastern time. I will be releasing my original song. It's called Somebody. And I'm super excited about it. I would regret not doing that. Dan Pink, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom, insights, stories, and humor with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it, Rachel.
All right. Wonderful. All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you in 2 weeks. Happy New Year.